Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Harp. Today we're going to be talking about mergers and acquisitions, M&A for short. So some of the main things I'll shed light on are what M&A is, why do people do it, how is it done, and who are some of the main participants in the industry. So M&A, or merger and acquisition, is nothing more but Company A buying or selling to Company B. For example, Company A is tired of the business. Maybe from extrapolated data, they believe the foreseeable future for the company does not seem like a good investment. They feel like it's best to cash out now so they can be personally, financially secure in the future. So, what do? They go and find a buyer to either merge or acquire said company. Now, this is a very brief and summarized way to put M&A, but it's a start. So, when diving more into some of the components of M&A, we first cross what are usually called deal structures. And so there are three main types of deal structures. The first of the three is called an asset sale. This is when you essentially look at the company's assets being sold and itemize every single item the buyer wants to purchase within that business, and transferring over said assets to the merging or acquiring company. For example, some of the things one might purchase in an asset sale would be desks, computers, people, files. Assets. People usually hear asset and immediately think it's one item, but ultimately it can be the whole thing. Another type of deal would be a stock/equity interest sale. This is when instead of Company A purchasing Company B's individual assets, they purchase the shares of the company. They're purchasing the entity that holds and contains said assets. Instead of purchasing each individual asset of the business, you are basically switching places with the original owners and exceeding their position. And the last type of main deal structure would be something called a merger. Statistically, mergers are the least common type of deal, since mergers are usually done in the upper market, where more public companies or corporations, for example, Amazon or Google, use this type of deal structure. Mergers are usually propelled by intense tax examinations or considerations, which in the upper echelon deals can be considerably altering as to the benefits and cons of the deal's outcome, or are decided due to wanting an easier transition between companies. In the basic sense, Company A and Company B come together. They synergize, and then one of them disappears, depending on who merged with who. Usually on the lower end of the market, you will have more asset sales, but as you progress up the chain, you enter more stock and equity sale based deals. So moving on, I'll talk more about the mergers and acquisitions process and how it is done. So the process starts with a seller who wants to sell his or her business. The first step would probably be identifying the market value of the seller's company. Now, there's a couple ways to do this, but mainly you will talk to either an investment banker or a business appraiser to find out what your company's value truly is. Then you will want to do some preparation for something called due diligence, and I'll talk more about that topic later on. But basically at this stage, you should be organizing important information such as contracts, financials, basically if you are about to be audited by the CRA, that kind of organized. Then the seller will preferably want to put together a group of people who will assist with getting the paperwork together and fleshing out the potential legalities of completing an M&A deal. Some of the people you're going to need are an investment banker to assist with marketing your business, a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, preferably one who has 3+ years experience, and a CPA/tax advisor who will assist with having a very in-depth understanding of the current federal tax system. So now that the seller has completed these tasks, it's now time to find a buyer. The process of finding a buyer can be completed in many different ways. A very common way that investment bankers use to advertise their company is by hosting what is called a two-round auction, or also known as a sequential auction. This is not your common auction where you sit down and listen to an individual collect bids, but it is of a similar landscape. What essentially happens is investment bankers take a look at a selected amount of target companies. that would most likely be interested in purchasing your business. Then, the bank reaches out to each individual company and tells them that X company is for sale, as well as giving them a teaser or an executive summary, which is essentially a small look into the business's inside financials and other more or less confidential information. At this point in time, notified potential buyers will place an amount of money which will show whether they are interested in seeing more of the company. Usually, if a company is interested, they will need to send or mail an IOI, or otherwise known as an indications of interest, before a certain deadline. Then the second round for bidding begins, and companies that showed little to no interest are not carried over to the next round. Then companies that show extreme interest place their bids, and the best choice for the seller is selected. They will then be given a confidential information memorandum, also known as a book in investment banker slang, which is similar to a teaser, but instead of being a 5 to 6 page compilation of information regarding the business, it will be a more in-depth version which could be over 50 plus pages of confidential information. After a buyer becomes interested, they will be required to sign an NDA, or otherwise known as a non-disclosure agreement. Then, after the agreement has been signed, they will have access to the selling company's records. Now, this allows them to start basic due diligence. A good solid definition for due diligence in relation to M&A is to confirm that a business for sale's represented value is valid. This means that the buying company is going to take a look at some of the basic factors of the business, covering financials and other more or less general components of the company, to see if the value they request for the business is relatively worth the same as the original price. If all goes well, then the merging or acquiring company will be required to send in a letter of intent, indicating that the deal is on. Now, a letter of intent is essentially a contract with certain bindings. Two of the most common bindings found within these letters that the seller must follow are the confidentiality binds and something called an exclusivity clause. Now, the confidentiality bind is self-explanatory, but regarding the exclusivity clause, this basically means that during the duration of the merger or acquisition, the seller will not be allowed to speak with other potential buyers and is locked into the deal. They may not also speak to others about anything regarding their company innards or the purchasing company's insides. The letter will also usually indicate what deal structure will be performed to complete the transition, such as, will this business be purchasing the equity of the business, the stock or LLC interests, or are they purchasing the individual assets like we talked about before? It will also show a detailed description of how the transition between companies will work. Now begins intense due diligence. At this point, the buyer will be thoroughly looking through all the records of the company. Every single nook and cranny will be noted. They will take notes of your liabilities, your assets, current contracts regardless of whether they were short-term or long-term. Everything about your company is given to them to analyze and make a decision on whether the value remains the same as the initial projected value. Just to recap, at this point in time, the seller would have selected a buyer, the seller is usually on an exclusivity provision, and major deal terms have been identified. In a general sense, both parties should be on the same page. Due diligence is usually projected to take around 6 weeks to do. Obviously, this is depending on the size of the company, but in some cases, it can take upwards of 2 to 3 months to complete. Finally, after all due diligence is completed and no major issues came up which would lead back to negotiating on the initial bid for the purchase of the company, the deal will be closed with both a binding purchase agreement and ancillary agreements. A binding purchase agreement basically means that after the purchase has been made, it is binded to the buyer and may not be given back to the seller in any way. Basically, what the agreement says is 1. What is being sold, 2. What the price is, and 3. What are the representations and warranties regarding the deal. After the deal is closed and finished, teams from both companies begin working on company integration. Now, I know it's a long process, but it gets the job done. And you can't be making mistakes with hundreds of thousands to billion-dollar deals. I think that is pretty much everything. We talked about what M&A is, why people do it, how it works, and who really contributes to making these huge deals follow through. Anyways, thanks for watching, and have a splendid evening.